Let's jump straight into it. The football war? This war started with a soccer match and ended with people hiding in ditches while planes flew overhead. By 1969, El Salvador and Honduras were already wound tight. Soccer didn't create the tension, it just poked it with a stick. The real problems were land, poverty, migration, and leaders who found anger useful. El Salvador was tiny, crowded, and desperately poor. Honduras was bigger, less crowded, and for years had absorbed Salvadoran migrants looking for farmland and work. By the late 1960s, around 300,000 Salvadorans were living in Honduras. Many had cleared land, built homes, and farmed for years without formal titles. Then Honduran President Oswaldo López Arellano pushed through land reform laws meant to help Honduran citizens. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, it wiped out Salvadoran farmers almost overnight. Families were dragged off land they had worked for decades. Crops were seized. Homes were burned or stripped. People fled with whatever they could carry. Entire villages emptied in days. Honduran newspapers described the migrants as invaders. Salvadoran radio stations described beatings, expulsions, and families sleeping outdoors after being forced across the border. Both governments leaned into it. In El Salvador, President Fidel Sánchez Hernández faced mounting pressure. His country was absorbing waves of angry, displaced people with nowhere to put them. Jobs vanished. Housing collapsed. Politicians and media framed Honduras as a brutal enemy humiliating Salvadorans on purpose. Then World Cup qualifying arrived. The timing could not have been worse. The first match was played in Tegucigalpa on June 8, 1969. Honduras won 1-0. What mattered more than the goal was everything around it. Salvadoran players barely slept. Crowds gathered outside their hotel all night, screaming, banging pots, lighting fires, and throwing objects. Police did little to stop it. By morning, the players looked exhausted and shaken. Salvadoran newspapers didn't write about missed passes or tactics. They wrote about abuse, about humiliation, about how Honduras had insulted the entire nation. The second match took place a week later in San Salvador. This time, Honduran players were the targets. Their hotel was surrounded, windows were smashed, flags were burned. Insults turned violent. Security was overwhelmed. Players later said they were afraid to leave their rooms. El Salvador won 3-0. The celebration outside the stadium wasn't just cheering. Honduran immigrants in El Salvador were attacked. Homes were vandalized. People ran through the streets with bags and children, trying to get out before things got worse. Police struggled to keep control. The third match was scheduled for neutral ground in Mexico City. By this point, soccer barely mattered. The match felt like a formality attached to something much bigger. El Salvador won again, qualifying for the World Cup. Within hours, El Salvador severed diplomatic relations with Honduras. That decision flipped a switch. Salvadoran radio stations spoke nonstop about murdered farmers and stolen land. Politicians described the situation as intolerable. Military leaders began moving units toward the border. The language shifted from outrage to inevitability. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador invaded Honduras. The war was chaotic from the start. El Salvador's military was under-equipped and rushed. Aircraft left over from World War II were pulled out of storage and sent into combat. Bombs were dropped on Honduran airfields, fuel depots, and cities with little precision. Honduras responded the same way. The sky filled with old planes fighting a modern war neither side was prepared for. On the ground, it was worse. Border towns emptied almost immediately. Civilians hid in fields, drainage ditches, and shallow trenches as artillery passed overhead. Roads clogged with refugees moving in both directions, unsure where safety actually was. Power went out. Water systems failed. Food disappeared fast. Soldiers advanced through villages already stripped bare. Houses were looted. Farms were trampled. Bodies lay in roads where no one could safely retrieve them. Hospitals overflowed with wounded civilians and soldiers alike, often without supplies or electricity. The fighting lasted about 4 days. It's often called the 100 Hours War, which sounds short until you realize how much damage 4 days can do. Thousands were killed or injured. Tens of thousands were displaced. Entire communities were shattered in less than a week. International pressure mounted quickly. The Organization of American States intervened, forcing a ceasefire. Neither El Salvador nor Honduras was ready for prolonged war, and both faced international condemnation. El Salvador withdrew its troops. On paper, the war ended. In reality, it didn't. The border stayed closed for years. Trade collapsed. Salvadoran refugees were stuck in limbo, unable to return to land that no longer existed. El Salvador absorbed tens of thousands of displaced people it couldn't support, worsening poverty and instability. Honduras hardened its policies. Resentment didn't fade, it settled in. Calling it the football war made it sound ridiculous. A bad match, a hot crowd, emotions running wild. But soccer didn't cause the war. It compressed everything. It turned years of fear, economic collapse, and political failure into 90-minute spectacles wrapped in flags and national pride. It gave leaders something simple to point at. It gave the public a scoreboard for anger. The ball didn't cross the line alone, everything else crossed with it. That's enough history for one video.